The most common type of incontinence is urinary incontinence, which means that it affects the bladder. This means that you will have unintentional leakage, and it is super common, but it's not something you should have to live with. So there's 3 types of urinary incontinence. The first is called stress urinary incontinence. This is common when you cough, sneeze, laugh, jump, and you feel that unintentional leakage. This is super common if you're an avid gym goer in things like CrossFit, gymnastics, or running. The next is urge incontinence, and this is often when you feel that sudden need to go to the toilet, often when you're getting to the front door or just as you enter the bathroom and you have this overwhelming urge to go to the loo and you end up leaking. So mixed urinary incontinence is just a combination of stress urinary incontinence and urge urinary incontinence, which means you may be struggling with some of these symptoms a little bit more often throughout your day and throughout your activities. First of all, being a woman, unfortunately, is a higher risk factor. 1 in 3 women do struggle with incontinence in the UK, and you've got 1 in 10 men who also struggle with pelvic floor weakness and incontinence. Incontinence is often more prevalent as we age. Unfortunately, like some other things, we're going to get weaker, especially for females when you hit the menopause. Because of the changes in our hormones, you can have a lack of estrogen, which can create muscle weakness. We also see a lot of females in the athletic population who struggle with incontinence, but often due to a hypertonic pelvic floor. Now, a hypertonic pelvic floor is something that is actually too tight, too spasmed, and therefore it cannot work at its full capacity. For these type of individuals, we need to work on relaxing the pelvic floor and then doing some strength work on top of that. If you're someone who really enjoys fizzy drinks and coffee like myself, unfortunately these are bladder irritants. If you're leaking, it's often thought that you're going to stop drinking water and try to allow your bladder to rest in some way. Unfortunately, this is not the case. You're going to be more dehydrated, your bladder will actually become a little bit more irritated, so it's important to try and definitely maximize that 1.5 to 3 litre intake, bearing in mind that involves any other teas, coffees that you are taking on. So if you are constipated and you're constantly straining on the toilet and pushing, unfortunately this is going to put more pressure on your pelvic floor and therefore it can create weakness. It's all about breathing and taking your time on the toilet and being able to get into those positions that are actually going to be assistive in allowing you to pass a stool. It's important when you go to the toilet to be in the right mindset. You don't want to take distractions like books, children, phones, music. You go to the toilet in order to pass. Therefore, you can be mindful, you can think about what you're doing, and you're less likely to strain. Now, there's something very glamorous called a squatty potty. This is the best way to go to the toilet for everyone, but especially if you do have pelvic floor issues or any weakness around your bladder and bowel. All you need to do is get a little homemade stool, or you can pop some books underneath your feet. You need to have your knees higher than your hips when you're on the toilet. You want to think about leaning forward. It's going to open up your back passage and allow you to pass with much less strain, a lot more comfort, and you can breathe through it as you go. If you're suffering from incontinence, it's important to learn and be assessed so you know what type of pelvic floor weakness or tightness you're struggling with. If you have a hypertonic pelvic floor, it's important to look at relaxation, trigger point relief, manual therapy, and some hip stretches, glute stretches in order to work on this. If you have a weak pelvic floor, we can then give you the appropriate strengthening exercises in order to work on your pelvic floor strength, your core strength, and your stability around your pelvis. So you may have heard people talk about the knack. This is an activation of your pelvic floor before you're going to do an activity that you know is a little bit triggering for you. This could be a cough, sneeze, laugh, something you know you're about to do. You want to think about switching on your pelvic floor before that activity comes, so you're prepping your pelvic floor before you do that. The knack is appropriate if you have pelvic floor weakness, but it's not appropriate if you've got a hyper tight pelvic floor. If you have a hypotonic and a weaker pelvic floor, you want to look at strength exercises. You want to start in a comfortable position, such as lying down on your back with the knees bent up or out to the sides, and you can focus on your activation throughout your pelvic floor. You want to progress this to sitting and then eventually up to standing. We can change the position of your feet whilst you're doing your pelvic floor strengthening. This could be with your feet turned out and standing, with your feet turned in, and then back to parallel. You also want to think about doing your pelvic floor strength exercises at different times of the day. You will be slightly more fatigued, for example, at the end of the day or first thing in the morning, and therefore your muscles will also be a bit tired. If you're struggling to understand if you're doing your pelvic floor exercises properly, it's important to go and get an internal women's health physiotherapy assessment. You can also try some things at home yourself, so you can lie on your bed, you can put pillow underneath your bottom, and therefore you'll be slightly higher at the hips, and this will assist the pelvic floor activation when you are trying your strength exercises. If you have a hypertonic and a tighter pelvic floor, we're going to do down training exercises. This is all about relaxation of your pelvic floor, stretching, and then mobilizations. This is super important to do, and therefore you will then be able to work your pelvic floor at its full capacity when it's not quite as tight. So you can do your down training exercises in a variety of positions. This involves stretching like child's pose, hip stretches, and working on pelvic floor release, which you can do by sitting on a fascia ball. You want to eventually build this up to different positions such as standing, and Pilates is a great form of pelvic floor relaxation. As you know, incontinence is super common, but it's not something you should have to be living with. It's important to go and see a women's health physiotherapist, and you can have a full assessment so we can work towards your own goals and treating you specifically, whether you have a hypertonic and a tighter pelvic floor or a hypotonic and a weaker pelvic floor. Knowing which one it is, we will be able to give you the correct management plan and helping relieve some of the symptoms you're struggling with. Just remember, please talk about this, ask the questions, and we can give you the right help.